The sit to stand is one of the most functional of all exercises and can also help reduce a person's risk for a fall. So let's do a deep dive into this leg exercise. Hi everyone, and welcome to Exercise for Health, and welcome back to a series where I break down a particular exercise to provide you with a comprehensive guide on how to perform it with correct technique, as well as look at the common mistakes people make, adaptations that may be required for certain health conditions, and also look at some variations or progressions that you can try once you've mastered the main movement. As this will be a very lengthy video due to the detailed nature of it, I've placed timestamps for the chapters in the description below. So in this episode, we'll be analysing the sit to stand, and I was going to combine this with the squat as the movements are pretty much identical. However, the vast number of variations of the squat would have made this video hours long, so I'll cover that as a separate exercise in a future video. But the sit to stand exercise is one that's used in some of my workout videos and is an exercise highly recommended for seniors, the elderly, or for people that would normally struggle performing a standard squat. Unless you are a wheelchair user, you will have the opportunity to practice this exercise every time you stand up or sit down throughout the day. So it's a functional exercise that helps with normal daily activity. It recruits many of the muscles in the legs, primarily the quadriceps muscles on the front of the thighs and the glute muscles around the bottom, but it's also assisted by the hamstring and calf muscles on the back of the legs. In addition, many of the core muscles around the spine and abdomen act to provide stability during the movement, and the adductors on the inner thighs can also play more of a role depending on your foot position. Also, if you're someone that's taller, then you're likely to find this exercise more challenging than someone that's shorter in stature because of the longer thigh bone and therefore longer leverage, shifting your centre of gravity further back when seated. This is a compound exercise, meaning that more than one joint is moving during the exercise. In the case of the sit to stand, these are the knees, hips and ankles. It is performed as a bodyweight exercise, but additional weights could theoretically be added, which we'll come on to later. The sit to stand exercises large muscle groups, and if it's performed at a tempo without a pause at the top or bottom of the movement, it can be very aerobic and get one breathless. However, the nature of the sit to stand is to encourage a slower tempo to help build strength in the working muscles to improve balance and stability and make it more functional. The great thing about this exercise is that you need no additional equipment other than what you're likely to have around the home, such as a chair, bed or sofa. And if it's an exercise you begin to find easy, then you can eventually progress to a squat without the support behind you. In a systematic review of 10 studies from 2015, it was concluded that adults would benefit from doing 45 sit to stands every day in a similar fashion to conducting 10,000 steps a day. But it also acknowledged that people with certain health conditions would expect to do fewer than this. Secondly, this exercise is also used as a test to determine one's risk for a fall, known as the 30-second sit to stand test. This is where a person is asked to perform the movement without the use of any aids or use of their arms as many times as possible in 30 seconds. Their final result is checked against a table to show their risk. I've covered this in more detail in another video, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Before you start the sit to stand exercise, you need to get your setup right first. If you're doing this for the first time, then it would be advisable to find a chair with a seat height that when you're sat down, your hips aren't lower than your knees, so the thighs are parallel to the floor. If necessary, you may need a higher seated position so that your hips are higher than your knees, like I'm demonstrating here on the armrests of my chair. Secondly, the chair needs to be stable and not likely to move around. So ideally, if you're using a dining room chair or classroom type chair, then ensure that the back of the chair is flat up to a wall to make sure it doesn't move when you're performing the exercise. When you're ready to begin, start seated but near the front half of your chair. So if needed, shuffle your bottom forwards. Then make sure that your feet are flat on the floor and hips width wide and your knees are the same width directly over the toes. Looking at your knees, they should be pointing in the same direction as your toes, which should be straight forwards. If your ankle mobility is limited, you may need to turn the feet outwards slightly to get the heel flat on the floor. If so, make sure your knees start a bit wider too. If this is an exercise that is new to you or you think it may be difficult to stand from your chair, it's worth placing your hands on the seat of the chair next to your hips. This will help provide a bit of support on the initial lift and final descent to give you a bit more confidence with the exercise. To initiate the movement, lean your torso forwards, bending at the hip rather than the spine, so keep your head and chest up. As you move your torso further forwards to get your nose over your toes, you will feel a decrease in pressure through your bottom on the seat and an increase in foot pressure on the floor. You should continue the movement forwards until you reach a balance point where your hips have just raised off the seat and can hover. You don't need to hold this position, but I'm just pointing out how far your upper body has to come forwards before you can transition into the second phase of the movement. This is certainly the most difficult part of the exercise because of the balance involved with the movement, hence why it's worth keeping additional contact with the hands on the chair. And I've had some people that were recovering from a stroke just focus on the first phase of this movement by getting to the hover position and then sitting back down to help train the brain of this initial lift and improve their balance. Once you have reached the hover though, remove your hands from the seat of the chair and aim to continue the movement up to standing by straightening the knees and bringing the hips forwards until you're fully upright and in balance. This completes the first half or standing part of the exercise. Now to move into the second half or sitting movement. This should be performed slower than the standing movement as you are working the muscles eccentrically, meaning they are lengthening under contraction, which will massively help to improve the strength in the leg muscles. So to initiate this movement, we are essentially doing the first part in reverse. Start by bending at the hips, pushing them backwards, a bit like closing a drawer behind you with your bottom, while slowly bending the knees so your centre of gravity is always between your feet until you reach that hover point again. Have your hands beside you, reaching back towards the chair for guidance, and when you have made contact, slowly bring your bottom down to gently contact the seat of the chair and bring your torso back to an upright position. When you are sat upright, you have completed the entire repetition and you're ready to start the exercise again. Right, let's now point out some of the common mistakes that are made during this exercise. The most common one is not bringing your torso forwards enough to initiate the lift of the hips from the chair. In most cases, this is a confidence issue as you are worried about tumbling forwards and face planting the ground. However, to get around this, some will start to rock backwards and forwards to use momentum to get them moving up and potentially losing their balance at the top. This, however, creates a lack of control with the stand phase and isn't good practice for building strength in the long term. So a better way around this would be to start from a higher seated position until the standing part can be done in a controlled manner and then gradually reduce the height of the seat to make progress. The next mistake is allowing the knees to collapse inwards during either the standing or sitting phase. This is normally caused by a weakness of the glute medius muscle on the outside of the hip, which helps to maintain hip stability. Although a bit of lateral movement of the knee inwards or outwards is normal, excessive movement that causes the foot to roll inwards or outwards and not stay flat should be discouraged. Now you can get around this by placing an object like a ball between your knees, which will restrict this movement, but it would be more beneficial to try and activate the glute medius muscles during the standing and sitting phases, and to do that, it's best to have a looped band around the knees during the exercise to keep it stretched throughout the movement, and this will help train the brain to activate the glutes, outwardly rotating the hips so less stress is placed on the inside of the knee. The third mistake is lacking control, particularly on the final descent back to your seat. Some will get so far down and then just switch off, falling back into their chair, risking whiplash in their neck or banging their head behind them. Therefore, this final phase back into the chair should be conducted as slow and controlled as possible. To help this, you can do the descent in small stages, stopping at various points to show that you're in control of the movement. If necessary, use your hands more to guide you back into your seat until your confidence and strength improves. The next mistake is using your arms more than your legs. The main purpose of this exercise is to work the muscles in the legs, so the arms should only be used if absolutely necessary and really for balance and guidance. If you're placing your hands on the armrests of your chair and pushing on them, it's likely not much of your body weight will be put through the leg muscles. If you need to use your arms more than having them by your side for guidance as shown earlier, then you can place your hands on your knees to make it easier, or place your hands on a support in front of you. But again, only for balance and confidence, not to pull or push up on. Gradually over time, as your strength improves, your hands won't need contact with the chair or support, and you can either reach them out in front of you, which will help with the counterbalance of your weight for the initial movement or final descent, or even progress to folding your arms across your chest, which limits the arm involvement altogether, making the exercise harder. The next one is having your feet too far forwards and not having your knees over your toes. Although some people think this is bad for your knees, which it isn't, trying to stand up with the shins vertical or perpendicular to the ground is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, because your centre of gravity will be too far back behind the feet. We are designed to be able to squat with the knees past the toes, but we lose this ability through our sedentary behaviour. You shouldn't have the knees so far forwards that the heels raise up from the floor, so how far your knees go forward, ensuring that your feet stay flat, will be dependent on your ankle mobility. You must though have your centre of gravity between your feet before you can raise from your chair, so keep the feet back underneath your thighs. The final mistake is varying your weight distribution over your feet. Some people favour one leg more than the other, so their hips shift to that favoured side, meaning that their weight is not evenly split between the right and left foot. This is quite common in people that have had a knee or hip replacement, or get joint pain on one side, or if they have a neurological impairment where one leg is sufficiently weaker. In addition, some people don't keep their feet planted into the ground, maintaining good contact with the 3 points of the foot between the heel and the ball of the foot. This is less likely to happen, but you should think about pushing the floor away from you once you've reached the hover position and being in tune with your foot contact on the floor. It's sometimes good to try this movement without shoes on so you can feel what's happening during the movement. Although the sit to stand is something we should all be able to do, and it's particularly good for people with osteoporosis or osteopenia, some health conditions may pose additional risks with this exercise. But that's not to say the exercise can't be performed, but rather that extra measures should be put in place so the exercise can be attempted safely. The first is any type of neurological condition such as Parkinson's, MS, a previous stroke that has left an impairment or weakness on one side, or any other condition that affects the person's balance. Extra measures would be to include additional supports around them that they can hold on to or grab during the movement if needed. In cases where the person has lost a lot of confidence or ability, having one-to-one support with another person to offer support and gentle encouragement can also be a big help. The second one is lower limb joint pain from arthritis, or if one is recovering from a knee or hip replacement or has had ankle surgery. Again, this exercise will be very beneficial, but if the movement causes additional pain, then you may need to restrict the movement by making it shallower. This is starting from a higher seated position. It's important that you work within your limits initially, and as your strength improves and the onset of pain reduces, you can begin to increase the range of movement again. Some people that are suffering from low back pain may find this exercise more difficult due to the load placed upon the core muscles to maintain spinal stability during the movement. This is particularly apparent at the hover part of the sit to stand due to the angle of flexion in the hip joint. If the lower back begins to round off, then the lower back muscles are having to work harder. So if you get this problem, start from a higher seated position until your strength in your core and your mobility in your hips improve. Finally, people with certain health conditions that can cause excessive fatigue and breathlessness, such as COPD and heart failure, will probably not be able to do very many sit to stands in one set. As mentioned earlier, the large number of muscles working increases the demand for oxygen, meaning that one will feel breathless. For this population, I would suggest taking a longer pause when sat back down before starting the stand again, or you could do a short set of 2 or 3 reps before taking a short rest and then starting again, rather than attempting to do 10 or 15 all at once. So go on how you feel, and as you're performing them, be conservative until you get to grips with the exercise. Now let's look at some variations and progressions that you can make to spice the exercise up a bit. Firstly, you can vary the foot position laterally. This can be with the feet and knees narrower, which will reduce the base of support, making the balance aspect of the exercise more challenging and working the muscles around the outside of the hip more. This is harder. Or you could increase the width of your feet into more of a sumo stance position, meaning that the inner thigh muscles have to work more, but with the feet and knees being wider, it will bring your center of gravity forwards so that you won't need to lean the torso forwards as much. This is effectively easier. In addition to moving the feet narrower or wider, you can adjust the foot position to be further forwards or backwards. If you start with your feet in their normal position, and then for example move the right foot a few inches further forwards, this will place more demand on the muscles in the left leg when standing up and sitting back down. Furthermore, if you extend the right leg out fully so the heel of the foot is on the floor, the sit to stand becomes incredibly difficult for the left leg and for your balance. This would be very advanced. You could also bring one foot further back under the chair. If you keep the foot flat, it will encourage a greater range of movement for the ankle, or if you bring it back even further so it's on the ball of the foot, you'll place more emphasis on the muscles around that knee as it's bending much more, so not advised for anyone with painful knees. Earlier, we discussed the use of the hands, whether you need them on a support that is in front of you, with your hands on your knees, with your hands on the chair, or whether they're needed just for balance, such as being out in front of you. But if you can do the sit to stand without your arms so that they're folded across your chest, you may be in a position to add some weight to the exercise. This could be holding a small weight on the chest, or if you find that uncomfortable, just holding the weights by your side and then you sit to stand with them. Just ensure that you maintain good posture of the torso so that the added weight doesn't start bending your spine over. Next, you can make this exercise harder by lowering the seat that you're standing up from. If you're on a low sofa or chair, then this can be more challenging as the hips and knees are bent more, therefore placing more demand on the working muscles. You may need to do this in gradual stages though, so using cushions or pillows under your bottom can vary the height in increments. If you can stand up from a position where your hips are lower than your knees, you're probably able to move on to a squat exercise. Finally, the last variation is being able to stand but not sit fully. In other words, as you're lowering back down, you get to the point where your bottom kisses the seat and then you return back to the standing position. This is a great way to transition to a squat movement, which is really what this exercise has now become. You still have the confidence knowing that the chair is behind you to sit on if needed, but you are no longer resting the muscles in a seated position. You are continually working them until you finish your desired number of reps. It makes good sense to practice the technique every time you sit or stand throughout the day to encourage you to engage the leg muscles without too much aid from the arms, because the more frequently you do the movement correctly, the easier the exercise will become. Let me know your thoughts on this breakdown and if it's something that helps you with your exercise routines. Also comment below if you want me to break down another popular exercise, but I hope the information in this video is useful to you. If so, please give it a like by clicking the thumbs up button below and consider subscribing if you haven't already. You can also check out the description below for ways that you can help support this channel. But thank you so much for watching, and until next time, stay active and keep moving to feel better.